Cost accounting 6A, equivalent units of production using the weighted average and FIFO method. This is Ken Boyd, the owner of St. Louis Test Prep. Here's our Facebook page, the website, and the book Cost Accounting for Dummies that I teach in a free weekly live chat. What I've done is, based on a question I was asked for a student, I've taken a template that I used when I wrote the book Cost Accounting for Dummies. This information is taken from chapter 16, which is the chapter on process costing. So let's talk about first why we have equivalent units to begin with. Equivalent units is a way of assigning costs to a unit of production when units in production are in different stages of completion. So some units are 40% done, some units are 80% done. The question is, how can we have an apples to apples comparison where we can put a cost per unit on each item? And one of the ways we do it is to create equivalent units. Now, what makes this subject difficult is that there is a FIFO method, first in, first out, like inventory accounting, and there is a weighted average method over here. They're similar but not the same. And the type of question that makes this the most difficult is when there is some beginning and some ending inventory. This student had a question that only dealt with labor costs, so I put in parentheses here conversion costs only. So there's no material, there's no overhead. We're only considering the conversion cost that relates to labor. Normally, conversion cost is both labor and overhead. Those are the costs to convert material into a final product. That's why we call them conversion costs. So just think about it in terms of labor costs for this example. Finally, before I start, you'll notice that I include tables, references from the book in these examples. So you can actually look at the book and see the references, the tables that I use for this example. So the thing we start with first is, what is the physical flow of units? Before we even think about money, think about how the units flow. So we have some work in process beginning that we're given. And for FIFO, we need to split up the units that are completed and transferred out, indicating that they're finished goods. Some of the units completed and transferred out come from beginning work in process, the 38,000. FIFO assumes that those 38,000 units that are in work in process, that are not completely done yet, are finished during the period. They are the first units that are finished, hence the term first in, first out. So of the completed and transferred out units, which total 174,000, we're given that, 38,000 of the units are the beginning work in process units, and the difference, 136,000, are started and completed during the period. Now, we were given beginning WIP, we were given completed items, and we were given items that are in work in process at the end of the period. What we were not given was units started during the period. But we can figure that out if we have the other three variables. So what I did over here in note 1 was say, how do we figure out units started during the period? Well, we take the total units we need to account for, which is 205, the sum of these two numbers, and we subtract off the units that were in beginning work in process, and we come up with units started during the period, 167,000. I know that's true because the units to account for, made up of beginning WIP and started items, has to equal units accounted for. And I always say at this point that for the units accounted for section, units in production only end up in one of two places. Either they're completed and transferred out, which means we finished them, or they're in ending work in process. Now that we've got the unit, and by the way, units accounted for has to balance with units accounted for. Now that we've finished that, we can think about the equivalent units themselves, in which case we multiply the units, the physical actual units, by the percentage they're complete. So If the beginning work in process units are finished during the period, and 49% of the work happened before the period, the month, that means that the difference, 51%, was completed during the month. So if we multiply 38,000 units from beginning WIP that are finished times 51%, we get 19,380 equivalent units. One thing to remember is units that are started and completed during the period, by definition, 100% of the work is completed during the period. So we add those up, we get a subtotal of 155,380. Work in process ending, we're told in the question that those units are 76% complete. And again, that's during this period, because it's assumed that the beginning work in process is gone. That means that the ending work in process units must have been started during the period. So the entire 76% was worked on during this period, because these ending work in process units are from the started and completed group. So if I multiply 76% times the 31,000 units, I get 23,560 is the equivalent units, and then I can add up all my equivalent units in red, the 178,940. The next thing I do is assign the cost. So I'm given work in process beginning. I'm given that cost number. I'm given costs added during production. I get a total cost incurred to date, 825,175. Now, another thing that's interesting is that we are including all costs incurred to make the items. That includes beginning work in process. So the beginning work in process costs are included because that's a cost to make the product, and we call it cost incurred to date. I then take the units of production that I figured out up above, and I divide cost by equivalent units, and I get cost per equivalent unit, the 461. Now I can wrap up here by checking my work. That's what we mean by assignment of costs, because if I take, for units transferred out, the 461 equivalent units times the equivalent units that were completed and transferred out in blue, I get the 716 total. And if I take the work in process ending units, equivalent units that I figured out, the 23,560, and I multiply it by the cost per equivalent unit in green, I get another subtotal, 108,646. And if I add them up, I see that I've accounted for the entire 825,175 of costs. I know that I figured out my cost per equivalent unit correctly because I've got all the costs assigned. Finishing up quickly with weighted average method, there's not too much of a difference other than to say that the work in process of the prior month is considered beginning work in process this month. So I could take, same process, ending work in process units, multiply it by 49%, I get the same equivalent units of production. But what I can do is take the total cost for ending work in process, the 98,000 that we saw earlier, and I can figure out a cost per equivalent unit just for that work in process beginning of 526. You'll see that set up that way in many textbooks. So in this example, you'll see before we did for beginning work in process, there's the 19,380. In this instance, with weighted average, we calculate the cost per equivalent unit up above, and we plug it in down here. So you can see how the units are computed up here for equivalent units of production, and we plug it in down here using the 49%. We plug it in down here. This example, we use the 51% completed during the period. In weighted average, we use the 49% and plug it in down here. Everything else is the same, but we see we get an equivalent units of production using weighted average slightly different. This is 197,560 before we got a slightly lower number. Other than that, the process is the same. The template that I have is a little bit different because I put the totals here. This was for material, which we don't need. This is for conversion. Same costs given in the question. Same total cost to assign. Slightly different equivalent units of production. We come up with a slightly different cost per equivalent unit, but the good news is we can still take that cost per equivalent unit and tie back to our total costs that we need to assign. For example, I can take for units completed and transferred out, cost per equivalent unit in green times equivalent units of production in green up above, green versus really blue, I get a total. I can take my ending work in process, again, cost per equivalent unit in that greenish color times ending work in process in blue. And if I add those two up, this data is the same as the data right here. I get total cost to assign 825, 175, the same result we got on the other page. So the difference is that with weighted average, we compute equivalent units of production separately and add that into the chart here. Whereas with FIFO method, assuming that the first units in are sold first, we calculated the beginning work in process equivalent units down here. That's as far as we're going to get on this topic. Remember our toughest accounting topics, upcoming live chats that I teach on an ongoing basis. These dates are updated constantly. That's one thing that people need that for the toughest topics in accounting that I'm always asked about. And the other thing is that the book, Cost Accounting for Dummies, I teach a free live chat. Try to do it every week where we cover about a chapter of the book. So if you'd like information on that free course, you can email me and we'll get you on the invite list. I teach it about every week and about a chapter a week. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.